Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, NarraScope, for having me. I'm going to jump right into it. I'm Jess. I'm a visiting assistant professor of game design at Hampshire College. I'm also a writer and narrative designer with Red Thread Games. I also publish academic writing when I can. I recently worked on a VR project with Studio Cheer. I'm about to release an educational game for Carnegie Hall, and I worked for 3 years as senior writer and editor on Dustborn, which was arguably the most unnecessarily contentious release of. And I worked for 3 years as senior writer and editor on Dustborn, which was arguably the most unnecessarily contentious release of 2024. I've also worked on audio-only projects, short video content, and theatrical productions extensively. Here on this slide, you can see the graphics for some companies, studios, publications that I've worked with, sometimes for years at a time, sometimes just for a couple of weeks. So let's get into what we'll be talking about. We're going to be talking about creating more efficient, modular, and responsive narrative processes, including, but not limited to, story units, mirroring gameplay language, narrative formats and engines, modularity, readability, and documentation, but don't worry, not the highly technical kind. So the intended context for this talk is going to be aimed directly at narrative designers who are creating stories from scratch. It's of course going to be useful to other people, especially producers and designers. I'm also going to be operating under the assumption that mechanics get developed before narrative, though of course it doesn't always work that way. An example of what I'm talking about, a contract narrative designer who comes on at the end of pre-production. The game has a working demo, but no structured story. The team likely has an elevator pitch from the narrative, but not anything substantial or final. This is somebody who would probably benefit from this talk. Or let's say team leadership brings on a game writer because they know their game needs a story, but they're not really sure what the story should be or how it should fit with the other elements. This could happen quite early in the production process or quite late. Another disclaimer here is a lot of the guidance I'm offering is ideally followed in the early days of narratively designing a project. Putting in a couple days of effort before diving into the more craft-focused writing tasks will save you a lot of pain in the long run. That said, much of this advice for improving your workflow can be helpful even if you're already months or years into developing a game narrative. So we're going to take a look at a core issue. If you're a narrative designer, this screenshot that I have on this slide here looks probably pretty familiar to you. This is a photo of the yarn file for my first grad thesis milestone build, and I'll say it's not even particularly bad. At this point, the project had maybe 10,000 words, so it wasn't too text-heavy. You can see there's some structure to it. Things are grouped together. I created some grid layouts. There's clear intent. However, intent does not ensure readability, which leads us to this, which, as I'm sure many of you can read, I ain't reading all that. I'm happy for you, though, or sorry that happened. You don't want this response to be any of your direct collaborators, and you especially don't want it to be your creative director, supervisor, or producer. I will say programmers are usually pretty willing to dive in and take the time to learn how to read something like this, because they're used to it, and also they don't have much choice as the people responsible for implementing it most of the time. So this issue is a product of the form. Game narratives and their structures vary wildly from game to game and genre to genre. We're always innovating, subverting, reframing, and more. We reinvent the wheel a lot. I don't think that's a bad thing, but it can be a hard thing. We don't have many blueprints to follow. The comparison point I use is that in the film industry, you have the screenplay. Even if you're totally unfamiliar with the format, there are pretty specific guidelines for how to write, and just importantly, read a screenplay. The games industry does not have an equivalent of that form, even in situations where we're literally using screenwriting tools and formats. So, if we are starting from the ground up, building a narrative, we need to identify our basic story units. When I say story units, I just mean any building blocks you use for your game narrative. To extend my example from the film industry, the story units of a movie are traditionally scenes, which are assembled in a particular order to create the film. Disclaimer is that I'm not using film as a reference because I think games ought to follow a similar trajectory, as many people often assume. Movies are just an easy comparison point because most people are familiar with them. Moving on. I generally recommend identifying your story units before you pick a story engine like Yarn or Ink or Artisy. I'll be talking more about those in a minute. Because certain tools are better at supporting different kinds of story units. So I've listed some examples here. Normally, at this point, I would take a beat to crowdsource suggestions from the audience for these lists, but this talk is pre-recorded, so I will just rattle off a few. Some traditional story units, chapters, books, acts, beats. You can also think outside the box with ones like buckets, zones, tables. I've worked on things where we described story moments as guns because we were priming these narrative elements one by one to have explosive impact later in the game. That was a fun way to discuss them, and it always kept us locked into the energy and the utility of the story units. A friend of mine described short dialogues in their project as snakes and ladders because there were story moments that propelled relationships forward and ones that caused rapid deterioration and backsliding in the characters' dynamics. So propelling forward, climbing the ladder, backsliding rapidly, those would be the snakes. These are all great terms, especially if you come up with these story units in collaboration with teammates. Language that feeds team enthusiasm and understanding is ideal. Also, do embrace having multiple units that don't necessarily nest within each other. You'll have units, maybe subunits, but also separate units like barks and item descriptions that might have to live somewhat separately from your standard scenes and zones and whatnot. Do also keep in mind that if you have a producer, the terms that you use for your story units will probably be added to your task board or other production tools, so make sure it won't be too confusing at a glance to understand what story units mean. This is a risk you run with the less traditional story unit names, which brings us to another important point, mirroring existing gameplay, design, and infrastructure language. Mirroring existing design language is mostly about making sure you're locked in with the rest of your team and building your narrative in a way that complements the work everyone else is doing. I acknowledge this may seem very obvious. However, 9 times out of 10, narrative designers are left to our own devices to cook up a story structure. Unsupervised, we're likely to come up with structures and naming conventions that make excellent sense narratively. However, things that make excellent sense narratively may or may not map onto your teammates' work in any coherent way at all. In practice, this, as you might be able to tell, is not just about identifying good language for your story units. It'll inform other things as well. Language is a really great guiding presence, especially when you're in the story business. We've got a really direct example of how this could work on the slide. If your game already has combat encounters, an obvious way to think about your story units is as story encounters. You can and should look to design builders and gameplay verbs for inspiration, which will be incredibly helpful also in choosing a story engine. So you're going to pick a story engine. For clarity, when I say story engine, I mean the system or tool that facilitates the generation, management, and execution of narrative content in a game. You don't always need a specific tool designed for this purpose. You might work in Word or Google Docs. You might participate in the grand tradition of putting all your text in a spreadsheet. You might just paste text into a JSON file. Your studio might also have a custom in-house story engine, or they may have already settled on the story tool that they want to use. If they have not yet, here are some considerations. I generally advise against defaulting to the tool that is most familiar to you. Familiarity is super useful, but not as important as utility. Also think about what kind of storytelling you'll be doing and what assets you'll need to accomplish it. Something very environmental will generally work well with a story engine that has more visual sensibilities. Choice-focused gameplay will usually be complemented by a story engine built to support lots of branching and variables. Also think about how big the volume of text will get and how many people will have direct hands on it. Some story tools support multiple collaborators better than others. There are lots of questions to answer here. Will you be working with voice actors? Will there be motion capture for major cutscenes? Whose job is it to integrate the story materials into the game engine? Try to answer these questions before you commit to a single game engine. Now, I'm going to give you a couple examples. We'll go over the pros and cons of a couple story engines. They're going to be pretty accessible. We'll start with Miro. There are a lot of pros to a tool like Miro. Collaboration is extremely easy. I just stole this screenshot from Miro's press materials. There are a ton of markup options. You can see the different collaborators' cursors and names. You can see what elements they're interacting. You can see what they're adding and what they're modifying. You could revise and iterate really quickly. There are a lot of options for visualizing progression. I worked on a game recently that was very visual, and I relied heavily on Miro for doing the design work. It was a great tool for a game that focused on visuals and focused less on text. There are some cons to Miro, of course. It does not integrate directly into game engines. It is extremely highly versatile, but it generally is not. It's not one of the tools that is designed explicitly for game narrative, so it doesn't integrate into Unity or Unreal. There also is not great version control or edit history. It's pretty hard to track changes over time, and it also struggles with large image files and high volumes of text. Now we have a very different tool, which you can tell just by taking a glance at it. This is ink. We love ink. You can see some of the pros and cons right away. Some pros: manages choices, variables, and high volumes of text really, really well. This is a tool that does integrate directly into Unity and Unreal as well. And you can test your work directly in the tool. You can see on the right side of that screenshot, there's a panel where you can test the options that have been written out in the left side of the panel. Some cons: it's not very visual. It's not easy to visualize the structure in general, and it can be difficult to organize, revise, and collaborate. We can go on with more examples, but we're on a clock here, and I think you can start to see the analysis of tool functions that goes into picking a story engine. A necessity of any game story, whether it's branching or linear, regardless of what story engine you use, is modularity. As we know, game development is an iterative process. Narratives will have to pivot quickly to match new directions and to fill gaps in gameplay. But also, more importantly, your creative director or supervisor will, guaranteed at some point, tell you very suddenly to cut or add a major element, and it will be your job as a narrative designer to account for how that change affects the rest of the narrative structure and workflow. To accommodate sudden pivots and rapid iteration and keep your process modular, these are some things that you're going to want to have. Often you'll want to have a single master file or master document. The clear benefit of this is that there are fewer files to maintain for you and also fewer files to implement or reference for your collaborators. You're going to want this file to be comprehensive, a one-stop shop for all things narrative. That way, if your teammates have questions about game story, they immediately know where to look. It'll save you some time as well for your main story file to be comprehensive. For example, if you're writing dialogue for voice actors, it helps to leave comments on line delivery or tone in the same file where the dialogue itself lives. However, for all this to work, your file needs to be flexible and stable. You want to structure it in such a way that you can make significant changes to some parts of the story without the rest of the story falling apart. I mean this less in terms of continuity and story sense and more in terms of implementation and functionality. For example, if you have to cut a particular dialogue, you don't want all the other dialogues in the game to stop working because they're triggered by a certain variable that only gets set in the scene that you've just cut. To illustrate that, in my very elegant flowchart here, you can see that cut scene I'm talking about, not cut scene, but rather scene that has been cut. That would be scene 2. If you get rid of scene 2, you wouldn't want scenes 1 or 3 to fall apart. Again, just talking about functionality. Obviously, when you make cuts, it'll necessitate rewrites, but you want as few things as possible to break when you make changes. It's worth noting you might not have a single main file, but a collection of a few main files. Sometimes that's necessary, sometimes that's important, sometimes that's the best way to do things. So that would be a collection of files, a repository even. Speaking of repositories, you're going to want to have some sort of version control, which is just another way of saying you're going to want to track and manage changes to your narrative over time. Odds are medium high that if you're using a story engine with Unity, Unreal, or Godot integration, important story files are probably already maintained in your studio's VCS, which would most often be Perforce or GitHub. The main thing here is that you want to be able to make significant changes to your game narrative and still be able to look back at the materials you had a week, a month, or a year ago. You never want to lose work. You always want to be able to see the work you had in past sprints. Relatedly, it's often tempting for us to just throw materials into a graveyard dock or a designated place for storing text that no longer fits in the project. And by all means, keep one of these if you want, but it's not a sufficient replacement for proper version control and file backups. Also, generally, just tracking changes, the history of the document in, say, Google Docs, in my experience, is not the most effective either. This is largely because you're responsible for remembering all the contexts for all the materials in a graveyard document. You simply cannot assume you're going to remember everything. You're going to forget why that punchy one-liner was so punchy, and it's better to have complete files that contain the old text and the original context. Now, I've said a lot of things at this point. I will say I really advocate for comprehensiveness in your files. However, sometimes files can be too comprehensive. They can get too cluttered with too much information. Probably some of the information will become outdated or irrelevant. If your main story file starts to feel too overwhelming or daunting for you or your team, don't be afraid to start fresh with new files that you populate with only the essential information for the production cycle you happen to be in. If you've kept your files flexible and stable and you've backed up your old versions, it can be incredibly clarifying to start a newer pared down story file or document, especially in response to bigger shifts in creative direction. So, at this point, we've talked about story units, mirroring gameplay language, narrative formats and engines, and modularity. Pretend you say, okay, fine, I'll do all these things. Maybe you're making a mobile coffee shop simulator. Your main story units are beats, and your other text that appears is brew text. We're calling it brew text to mirror the language that you use in-game for coffee making mechanics, brewing coffee. You have a branching story with a high volume of dialogue that changes based on a combination of variables, so you've chosen yarn as your story engine. You also have a moderately stable main story file that only breaks every once in a while, and it's backed up in your game's GitHub repository. We've addressed pretty much everything that we've talked about so far. As you may have anticipated, I have again tricked you all into listening to true facts about my graduate school thesis project. It still looked like this. I didn't have a creative director on the project, but if I did, their reaction still would have been this. So, in fairness, what we've talked about so far is mainly to set up your own workflow for success. However, the point of this talk is to improve production processes overall for both indie narrative designers and their teams. So this is where readability and documentation come in. To make things easier on your collaborators, you can do a few things within your story files and a few things outside your story files. Within your main story file, you should try to include a legend that explains briefly how to read the contents of that file. Identify story units for the reader, explain progression within the file, and flag anything that may cause confusion to the untrained eye. This doesn't necessarily have to be contained inside your main story file. It could also accompany it as a README text file. Relatedly, in your story files, be mindful of your naming conventions for certain nodes, passages of text, and other subsections. I know I've talked about specificity in language ad nauseum at this point, but it bears repeating. For example, if you have a certain dialogue that's triggered by entering a specific location, you may want to include that location name in the dialogue's title or tags for ease of reference. I'm also a huge advocate for color coding things whenever possible. Thankfully, many story tools allow you to color code your text or your text boxes or your nodes. Using bold and italics in your text formatting is really useful too. I'll give a super quick reductive example of how this could enhance a simple Google Doc. That's right, now you're getting a real look behind the curtain. This is my real actual writing. Feel free to use that. That's on the house. This is a perfectly sane and normal format for a first draft. We've probably all seen documents that look like this 1,000 times. But this is a decent amount of text without any distinguishing features, really, aside from the header. If you're not a writer and you're just looking for a few key details, it can be a pain to scan through everything. So this is a significant improvement that took maybe 90 seconds to execute. You can see, again, the original here, the version with significant improvement and minimal effort. It's nothing fancy, it's nothing crazy, it's just a bit of reformatting to draw the eye. The title has been retitled to include the location of the dialogue. The function summary of the dialogue directly beneath that title is italicized, so it doesn't get confused for actual story text. The parenthetical notes are in red. These stood out to me as things that are necessary knowledge for implementation. And player choice is bolded, since player choices are generally more important and resource intensive than NPC dialogue. You can see how someone coming in looking for, say, information that is only relevant for technical considerations would have an easier time scanning this document than the previous one. In a longer document, you might denote, for example, all animation considerations in blue. That way, when an animator comes looking for information, they can read the legend, see that their color is blue, and ignore all text that is not that color. Doing this can save a lot of people a lot of time. It can also save you a lot of meetings, which are generally a lot of work and a lot of effort. So avoiding them when you can is pretty helpful. Now, outside of your story files, there are many ways to communicate your work to your collaborators. You may find some of these useful. You may find some of these tedious. You can use different ones at different stages of development. And while I generally recommend working in as few files as possible, maintaining a couple documents that people actually read is better than maintaining one document that only you can understand. The one I consider most important is a story outline, ideally with highly visual elements. A recurring point here is that you want to minimize the amount of reading that your teammates have to do. We are reading enough, people don't want to read more. So if your story outline looks more like a flowchart, as you can see in that image, then a script treatment, that's generally for the best. Outlines are critical for discussing your work in large groups and creative discussions with multiple stakeholders. They're also going to be simplified versions of the final story text. So these outlines are going to be more modular, which, as we discussed, is critical for iteration. Another essential document to be familiar with, even if you don't rely on it much, is a design brief. One way to share your work with the team is to accompany every major deliverable with a corresponding design brief. This brief would summarize the function and purpose of your deliverable, as well as provide context for how it impacts other departments on your team. Relatedly, I think all narrative designers and game writers should practice making asset lists. These don't necessarily have to be external documents, and in theory, this is the sort of thing a producer would also be responsible for, but narrative is a widely underproduced discipline, which is why this talk is happening in the first place. An asset list would accompany major story units, like, for example, cutscenes. So if you're delivering a cutscene script or outline, you could write up an asset list for everything that it would include. For example, any major environment art needs, like if there is an important background detail that the dialogue necessitates, any important animations, like if a character trips and falls, for example, any audio assets required, like if there's a gun firing in the distance, and more. When you make an asset list, you're making a concerted effort to consider the impact your work has on your colleagues, which will make you a more thoughtful, proactive, and considerate collaborator. And last but not least, I've recently come around to sharing video tours and updates of my workflow with teammates. That circles back to the reading thing again. It is sometimes a big ask to get people to read a long design document or even a short design brief. Sometimes it is much easier to walk through major story updates in your documents by taking a screen recording and talking out loud to your peers. Generally, people find it less taxing to watch someone talk for 10 minutes than it is to read a document for 5. As an added bonus, people gain a better understanding of your work by getting a direct glimpse into your process and actually speaking conversationally to your team, even if it's just one-sided, a lot like this talk happening right now, does contribute to stronger relationships. All said, finding a good production process for game narratives takes a lot of trial and error, and it will still take a lot of trial and error, even if you keep story units, modularity, readability, naming conventions in mind. No advice that I give is going to do away with that process. However, I do think it's better to approach the trial and error of narrative production with strategy, optimism, and intent, which is easier to do when you know the pros and cons of various approaches. Studio culture also plays a big role in identifying the production and communication styles that are going to be most successful. If you're at an in-person office doing regular check-ins, maybe colleagues become more familiar with your process in an organic way, and you won't need to explain as much about your tools to the rest of the team. If your studio is mainly remote, you might have greater success with sending video updates as it makes your workflow less abstract. Sometimes, especially at larger studios, departments are very siloed and have very little overlap, so finding the right workflow for a game narrative might require you to communicate with primarily a producer in such a way that they're able to accurately summarize your work to the rest of the team. Sometimes studios are efficient, sometimes they aren't, most are a combination of both. But try to pay attention to why a studio functions the way it does, whether it's for financial, logistical, interpersonal reasons. This is to say, we can't all come in blazing with new ideas for productions, but try to see where there's room to improve the way your work gets done. Being mindful of this is almost always helpful, and it's the kind of thing people seek out in an employee. People want to hire developers who are experts in their specialty and are also capable of seeing how their work fits into the bigger picture. Hopefully, with everything I've said here today, you at least now feel more empowered to start the process of building a game narrative from the ground up and can utilize some of these tools in doing so. I hope you now feel like you can have a little bit more control over your workflow in the future. In conclusion, I am reading all that, and that's all I have for now. I'm Jess. My email and Blue Sky are listed on this slide. Do with them what you will. I'd love to hear thoughts, questions, feedback, or just say hi. Don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you for being here. Thank you, NarraScope, and I hope everyone has a great conference.